so much for having me today. And I'm from Southern Colorado, although I'm joining from Atlanta and haven't been home in quite some time, but it's exciting to be even in the virtual or imaginative space of Colorado. But given that space and the subject of this conference, I think it's also important for me to kind of locate myself and mark out my positionality. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of days in relation to everything we've been hearing, and also, again, the imaginative space of Colorado. And so I just want to note that I am a settler in the most direct and literal sense. In the 5 generations ago, my family stole and settled Apache land in what is now Southern Colorado. And that's land we have lived on ever since and upon which I was born. So it's interesting to have that situation, have that own kind of relationship to land and rootedness. So obviously I am a settler, and my paper is largely about settlers and our relationships to land, and for the most part is addressed to other settlers. My reason for this is that we settlers are indeed here and are indeed a problem. And I think it's our responsibility to figure out what to do with ourselves. And my hope is that this paper, contributes towards that work, but I'm not totally sold on this positioning myself, especially in light of critiques of settler colonialism studies. I'm thinking of Tiffany Lethabo-King, although I don't think it's a unique critique. But this idea that an emphasis on settlers and settler relationships to land acts to kind of obscure the ongoing and historical violence against Indigenous peoples. And I remain concerned about what happens when settlers center other settlers in decolonial scholarship. So I have some mixed feelings about the position I'm taking in this paper, and would be interested in hearing your thoughts on that discussion as well. So today I want to discuss land back movements and what they could mean for settlers, and foreground our ethical obligation in them, and discuss how we might make ourselves able to participate in a positive way. So to do so, I'm going to set up some more theoretical content around the connection between land and knowing and legitimacy. So I'm starting from the idea that epistemology and territory are indissociable from each other. This is true across many positionalities and in many different ways. Knowledge transpires in space, discloses space in different ways, and makes different possibilities appear or disappear. Importantly, space also circumscribes and particularizes knowledge. It helps give the boundaries of what is thinkable and knowable. The way this works for the modern/colonial project is certainly not exhaustive of the ways it does or could take place, but this project also cannot do without the fusion of land and knowledge. For modernity/coloniality's project of empire and the accompanying settler-conqueror subjectivity, the epistemic territorial interweaving transpires through the question or assertion of legitimacy. Land and knowing become fused precisely in the claim, in the act of claiming right, whether it is being right or having the right. Land and knowing are both transformed in this claim, co-constituted as determinable and boundable objects that are available for exclusive possession. Once constituted, they will mutually solidify each other. Modern/colonial epistemology entitles the settler-conqueror to possess land, while the possession and rule over land will substantiate the settler-conqueror's position as the one who knows and arbitrates truth and reality. Land and knowledge are created as something solid, as that which grounds and grants authorization. Both are departicularized and delocalized, turned into a universal and undifferentiated surface laid out for discovery, exploration, and acquisition. Both are formulated as having their ideal state be one of stability and consistency, and any tension, contradiction, or resistance becomes understood as a degradation or corruption of an original purity or coherency. Land is no longer a vibrant and messy set of complicated relations that are endlessly being reworked, renegotiated, reterritorialized, constantly changing the mode of habitation possible and the place in which it happens. Instead, land becomes the inert and determined ground that supports settler-conqueror subjects and their projects of homesteading and empire building. Through the exercise of epistemic and material violence, it is made to become the neutral and empty container which holds settler-conqueror priorities, produces wealth, and/or corroborates the authority of a sovereign ruler. Land, in other words, loses the capacity to look different from different places, to mean differently, or to create different possibilities. It ceases to be the place of run-ins and interruptions, of contestation, contamination, and cross-fertilization. It is no longer the place of tense and dynamic interaction that continually makes and remakes itself as a heterogeneous collectivity that is always slightly unknowable and completely unencompassable. Land is produced as that which is absolutely knowable, describable, static, and divisible. Everything that cannot be fit into the settler-conqueror system of order must be made to disappear. The settler-conqueror is asserting the right of exclusive and complete sovereignty and possession, and the land must be made to match, must be recapitulated as that which can yield stable and firm ground. Knowledge takes on the complementary, enabling, and authorizing character of being the pursuit of absolute certainty, of grounding its truth on a level of validity that is as deep down as we can go. It is the pursuit of the ground upon which we can stand to eliminate any inconsistency or contestation. It seeks the guaranteed validity that entitles us to dismiss anything that does not fit into the neatness of our orderly system. It is a principle that will entitle us to stability, a space free of tension and disagreement, free of dynamic renegotiation. I want to take a brief detour through Kant here, although I'm not a Kantian by expertise or inclination, but he is the paradigmatic example, both in terms of his goals and his influence, of the kind of epistemic territorial legitimacy and possession necessary for the modern colonial project and settler-conqueror subjectivity. Kant is explicitly trying to establish the minimal but absolutely guaranteed conditions of validity that will enable the world to be mapped, known, and possessed, that will allow both epistemology and territory to be the absolute ground of a univocal subjectivity. Kant's project is explicitly epistemological, but throughout he remains obsessed with spatial and genealogical metaphors. He is determined to establish a territory where everything, every element of our knowledge, can demonstrate its descendants from an objective origin, where everything derives from an irreducibly certain and valid truth. To do this means delineating the boundaries of what human knowledge can hope to be able to talk about. Kant is concerned with making sure that knowledge is not just metaphysical speculation, not mere groping among concepts, but that it springs from something firm and can secure itself to this origin, that it can provide its birth certificate. This is what the critique of pure reason is attempting, Kant says. The critique of pure reason, the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge, performs this by instituting, and this is quoting from the critique of pure reason, by instituting a court of justice by which reason may secure its rightful claims while dismissing all its groundless pretensions. For Kant, the successful result of this will be that, quote, there cannot be a single metaphysical problem that has not been solved here, or at least the solution of which the key has not been provided, end quote. As Kant will laboriously show, this court of justice summons everything before it, surveys and catalogs everything we claim to know, and makes it demonstrate how it can be traced back to something we can unequivocally stake our claim on. For Kant, this certainty is achieved by retreating from any claims about things in themselves, about truth as it might exist out there, and contenting ourselves instead with that which we can claim on the basis of it making our human experience intelligible and coherent. For Kant, this turns out to be space, time, and the 12 categories of the understanding, about which we cannot say anything absolutely, but can only say that in order for humans to have the experiences they do, these things must exist for us. Importantly, the validity of these things is restricted to human thought, but that validity is universally applicable to everyone who is human. All subsequent knowledge must prove how it originates here, and this rigorous demand for concepts and ideas to show their ancestry finally hands us title to the land of truth. We arrive here, Kant tells us, by traveling through, surveying, and determining the place of each thing. This exhaustively known and firmly delineated land turns out to be an island, bounded by stormy seas of illusion and deception. This is how Kant describes it. Kant tells us it is the only ground upon which we can build, and that it is the critique of pure reason, this project of self-knowledge, that shows, quote, by what title we occupy even this land and can hold it securely against all hostile claims, end quote. So the proper use of human reason and the proper domain of human knowledge is that which can demonstrate a pure lineage to an autochthonous origin, that which can prove that it emerges from itself without any external contamination or interruption. This origin, this original earth out of which legitimate knowledge springs, is construed and defined as that minimal certainty that is universally valid and encompasses all human possibilities, because it is how we are able to speak coherently of human experience at all. This original solidity, then, that ground in which modern/colonial knowledge can root and secure itself, is based on nothing but the demand for sameness and approximation. Anything that could contest this knowledge has been thrown out a priori, as it is incapable of demonstrating its origin in Kant's a priori concepts. Kant's system hands over to itself a transcendental legitimacy to rule over and order everything else. But the essential validity and authority of this emerges from the comparison of likeness, masquerading as universal validity and believing itself to be exhaustive of human possibilities for knowing and being. This self-referential fiction is what Mignolo, following Santiago Castro Gomez, will call the hubris of the 0 point, or, following Umberto Maturana, objectivity without parenthesis. The settler-conqueror, located within the paradigm of modernity/coloniality, conflates their particularly situated knowledge and experience with the universal, assumes that land, as it appears to them, as empty, inert, mappable, and possessible, is all that it can or does mean. As Mignolo puts it, and I'm quoting from an article he wrote on Kant's geography here, he says, operating under the hubris of the 0 point blinds you to the fact that other people, their existence and knowledges, do not have the same problems you have, and therefore could not care less about your knowledge until the moment that you impose it upon them and tell them they are inferior and ignorant. Their reasoning is defective and their sense of the beautiful does not exist. You presume to know them because you describe them and put them in your system and your architectonic. So it's from this position, legitimated by a kind of universalized and transcendental rootedness in truth, that Europeans can move through the world, and indeed bring the space of a certain world into existence. Epistemic autochthony translates into mapping, defining, and claiming land as property in imperial territory. Cartography, as a kind of paradigmatic example of the union of the epistemic and territorial claim, allowed European geographers, including Kant, to dismiss, and this is quoting from Mignolo again, to dismiss the rest of the world to the benefit of their own universal surface. The map and alphabetically written description allowed them to eat the world, metaphorically and epistemically, and to possess it. The originary and exclusive legitimacy they grant themselves yields a transcendental autochthony that can exceed and supersede any merely empirical or contingent fact of indigeneity. Of course, the only way that modern/colonial maps can come to represent reality, the only thing that makes European assertions of exclusive territorial and epistemological right meaningful at all, is the capacity and willingness to exercise violence. This means at the foundational level, the original ground in which the settler-conqueror is rooted is this violence itself. Dussel referenced this, we're talking about the irrational myth of modernity, to indicate that at the wellspring of European reason is not more reason, but just the violence of dispossession and genocide. The entire subjectivity of the settler is constituted in this gap between the claim of a transcendental rootedness and the definitional absence of roots in the land to which the settler arrives. The settler must actualize and materialize the claim, must make sure that the land truly is as tamed, possessible, and knowable as their reason demands. The myriad modalities of violence that the settler enacts, both spectacular and mundane, is part of the same project of eating the world, of absorbing it and incorporating it into a structure of sameness that preserves and substantiates the position of truth, goodness, and universality the settler has appointed for themselves. The point of all of this is to articulate the relationship to land and knowledge that makes up those of us who are settlers, and to try to foreground the ethical obligation incumbent upon us and the limitations that our positionality imposes. I take a cue from Eve Tuck and Kei-Wei Yang when they discuss the metaphorization of decolonization that, quote, makes possible a set of evasions, or settler moves to innocence, that problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. They continue, when metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it recenters theory. It extends innocence to the settler, and it entertains a settler futurity, end quote. This is another tactic of consumption and absorption, of reframing the world according to a settler perspective and with the intention of solidifying settler legitimacy. Settlers are inclined to align with projects of decolonization and repatriation of land that are under the umbrella of sovereignty and a granting of property or renegotiation of political rights, always granted and secured by the same settler colonial system of governing and knowing. These are certainly valid projects for indigenous people to take on as ameliorative and partial, as a stopgap harm reduction technique. But settlers cannot conflate indigenous attempts to reduce the immediacy and intensity of violence with real decolonization or with an actual return of indigenous land. This is precisely the settler move to innocence that Tuck and Yang reference. It's a solution that provides a way for settler subjectivity and knowledge to maintain the same essential structure while rearranging pieces, a slight reorganization or redistribution that stands in for digging up the roots of the structure itself. Those of us who are settlers exist, and we must find something to do with/about ourselves. We must find a way to remove ourselves as an obstacle to indigenous resurgence and self-determination. The question of what we must do with ourselves, of course, revolves around land. The settler must cede claim to indigenous lands, but as we have heard from many of the participants in this conference over the last couple days, this can't be a mere signing over of property or a legal juridical maneuver of exchange between political states. Settlers must take on land back movements, but they must take these seriously and honestly as the profound challenge to settler knowledge and subjectivity that they are. Land back cannot be a partial or piecemeal reconciliation between settlers and indigenous nations. It means the impossibility of settler reality, of the settler self as it currently exists, and the disappearance of settler futurity. As I've been trying to show, the settler relationship to land is deeply imbricated with the sense of legitimacy that runs through and subtends all our other structures of knowing and being. To renegotiate our relationship to land as a fixed and possessible entity we understand it to be is also a forfeiture of legitimacy and a dissolution of the self. Giving up land as a territorial possession is also giving it up as the stable and certain ground of all knowing, that which tells us we are entitled to the world and reality, that we are rooted in a kind of original authenticity and truth, and can fabricate our roots in any soil we choose. The settler must withdraw this root before ceasing to be a problem. Land cannot be returned in a sense that is commensurate with indigenous life, while the settler retains a claim to truth, reality, and subjectivity. Decolonization for the settler, then, means realizing that our knowledge, reason, and imagination are not up to the task, and that we must put ourselves in a kind of epistemic leap. Tuck and Yang provide a helpful explanation of what I mean by this leap when they write of the ethic of incommensurability that they use to describe the particularity and contingency of solidarity and non-metaphorical decolonization movements. They write, an ethic of incommensurability, which guides moves that unsettle innocence, stands in contrast to aims of reconciliation, which motivate settler moves to innocence. Reconciliation is about rescuing settler normalcy, about rescuing a settler future. Reconciliation is concerned with questions of what will decolonization look like? What will happen after abolition? What will be the consequences of decolonization for the settler? Incommensurability acknowledges that these questions need not, and perhaps cannot, be answered in order for decolonization to exist as a framework. We want to say first that decolonization is not obliged to answer those questions. Decolonization is not accountable to settlers or settler futurity, end quote. This is a leap lacking certainty or security, and with an unknown/unknowable point of arrival. It is staked on shedding exactly that sureness and sense of rootedness, shedding the originary claim to possession of land and or knowledge that made us able to define and locate ourselves in the first place, that gave us the ability to think up a future. In or after this leap, without the ground beneath our feet, I suggest that all we are left with is a kind of bodily, aesthetic, and affective comportment, a particularized and localized turning toward that which withdraws from and refuses us, that which remains opaque and dynamic. Taking a posture of openness and restraint is not about trying to penetrate, consume, absorb, or position in an order, to incorporate into the fully available domain of the known or mapped. If it is possible for the settler to cease being a problem, to cease being a settler as such, and this is a big if, it is my sense that it must come through the uncertain comportment of restraint that turns toward our own effacement as possessors of property, sovereign subjectivity, or absolute truth. It's a willingness to be in indeterminate relation with that which withdraws from our knowledge and refuses our habitation. I do not mean by this that decolonization becomes for settlers just a mental or emotional project, an attitude adjustment or affective shift that somehow relieves us of the violent expropriation and ongoing genocide contained in our mundane activities and epistemological assertions. Settler participation in decolonization is land back, but the settler must make themselves capable of hearing land back in the strongest, most unsettling, most uprooting register possible, in the register that makes a settler subjectivity and futurity impossible, that renders it as without meaning. When settlers talk about roots, we mean that which tells us we belong here, have a legitimate claim here. These are the roots that we must dig up entirely. To do so is to engage in direct material projects of care and restoration that actively contradict our sense of legitimacy and our claim to space, and which make no attempt to reconcile these projects with a sense of futurity or reality that we can imagine. For the settler, roots must stop being how we know we have a right to make a home somewhere and begin being that which holds us fast to the problem of ourselves, to the violence and culpability we both inherit and perpetuate, and that give us no room for a move to innocence. Roots, for us, must become an epistemic, ontological, territorial responsibility to withdraw from the safe and steady and to take on a responsive, humble posture where staking ourselves in this incommensurate and incomprehensible leap comes first and knowing comes last. Thank you.
Thank you, Teelin. We have about 8 minutes for questions for our presenter. And you can feel free to type it into the chat. I can read it out loud too, or you can just chime in.
Well, that's a good question. Thank you very much for that presentation, Teelin. In your conclusion, you discussed a kind of comportment or attunement, and not to be too micrological about this, but you mentioned a kind of willingness to hear. And you said it's not a mere affective comportment, right? Is it a case of needing to be willing in a case of a kind of autonomous subjectivity then, or could you expand more on what that comportment looks like?
Yeah, I like what you said just now about the autonomous subjectivity. That's interesting. I think that I don't want it to be confused as, Tak and Yang talk about this, and just the idea that, decolonize your mind and the rest will follow, and, that settlers just need to get in the right mindset, and then that will solve the problems if there's not those real material violences that need to be, that are the central focus of this. But when I say this, I do want to focus on it being this kind of affective and bodily phenomenon, because I think that to a certain degree that is what gives us a sort of like willingness or openness, or like really what I want to say is like a permeability after, or if it's possible for us to divest from settler sort of structures of knowledge. So precisely the structures that see us as sovereign subjects in possessible land where everything is fully knowable, fully definable, etc. So I do want to emphasize that I'm interested in comportment precisely because that I see that as a kind of like embodied and unknowable and permeable, like inherently responsible kind of posture that we can take. Yeah.
I also have a question, if I could jump in. Yeah, thank you, Teelin, for your presentation. And I was curious, you positioned yourself with your own background in Colorado. I also have a similar background, 5 generations of settlers on one side of my family. And I'm curious a bit about how you would apply this comportment, this epistemological approach, your project, to kind of contexts that aren't the Americas. I was thinking of other pieces of land where there are contested claims, just kind of globally, and some examples might be, as we know, troops are mobilizing, Russian troops at the borders of Russia and at the borders of these occupied regions, right, to kind of reclaim Ukraine. This dispute between Russians and Ukrainians, which is long. You can think of the movement to establish a Kurdish state. Or I think I was years ago in Mongolia, and kind of this conflict. You think of China and the kind of settling and colonization that the Chinese have done for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, and I'm just curious if you've done, and it's okay if you haven't, if you've done much thinking about this comportment, this approach of the settler comportment, in how, to what degree is it applicable to other empires and other states and other contested areas of land, where I feel like in the Americas, it's very, very clear that settler colonialism is a very specific narrative and a clear story, and it's clear that the white settlers are very much in the wrong, and in a way that's kind of hard to dispute, but where things are more disputed or a little bit murkier, I would be curious about your question, your answers to that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and not something that I've done a lot of thinking about for, I think, purely personal and biographical reasons. I am very consumed by the question of the Americas. But I think that there's a similar structure of like the difficulty that will always be imposed by a kind of universalizable claim to legitimacy, and that this structure of like absolute possession and absolute legitimacy will always bear with it certain problems. And I think that's why I'm interested in thinking about the like variability of even what land means or how we map it, and the different, the fact that land cannot be like bordered and mapped and constituted as such without asserting a kind of universalized perspective, or at least those are the possibilities that I think are kind of available to us within our epistemological basis. And I'm interested in the sort of like active mobile contestations of that mapping. So the fact that I think it is that I think assuming absolute possession over a territory will always have these problematic elements, basically, and that I don't think, in any context of empire, we can get away from that.
If I could just add a linguistic point here, I think this is a very good question because it calls for nuance. I mean, agree with Kerr in this thing, and there's something really unique. If you look at the overarching perspective of world history, and if we're going to really talk about these issues, we have to have some sense of world history, not just Western history, and not just the not just the colonial experience in the Americas. But the word colonia, it's a Latin word, it means settler. So in some words, the notion of settler colonialism is kind of a redundancy. You could look at the Roman Empire or even the formation, through this particular lens. One of the things you have in Americas is you have this, you have basically two worlds that did not have any experience of each other in the past. Even remotely, it's questionable, but there's not a lot of, archival records of it. Didn't even know the other existed, and the clash. I mean, if you look at what's called the shock of recognition, which is not just in America, but in places like the South Pacific and Australia and so forth, you see these meeting of two different worlds that had their own history and own genealogy, and they weren't always literate and non-literate. There were different kinds of literacy. For example, the Incas were very literate, but they didn't have writing as we know it in the West. So, I mean, how do you look at this clash of worlds in particular, which we still have in some ways? I mean, in some ways, the colonial difference is the epistemic difference. And that epistemic difference becomes a invitation to power differentials that lead to subjugation. We can't really talk about that here at the conference, but I think it's easy to get into a frame where we just think of one kind of historical territorial domain and say, okay, this is where it is. And of course, if you start to read a lot of even the indigenous literatures of other parts of the world, where you encounter, it's like, well, we don't have the literature, but we can kind of infer it, from the so-called Aryan invasion of the Indian subcontinent. 3,500, 4,000 years ago, and so forth. I mean, the very notion of the caste system. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We're at 2:31, and so I mean, I don't know if I see that Ricardo is here now, and I believe that Boaventura had to back out, and I'm not seeing Boaventura here, and I really wanted to hear that presentation, but we could keep having this conversation.
No,